Hey everyone, and coming up on today's episode, we've got Mike Nelson, who is a fellow Microsoft MVP. We're going to be talking about all things Windows Subsystem for Linux, what it is, how to use it, who's it for, use case examples, everything you ever wanted to know about Windows Subsystem for Linux, coming up on today's episode of the DOJO podcast. Well, hey everyone, welcome to the next episode of the DOJO podcast, the podcast designed to help you become the IT black belt within your organization. I'm your host, Andy Serwich, and with me here, I've got Mike Nelson, a good buddy of mine. How's it going, Mike?
Hey, pretty good, Andy. How are you?
Good. Hey, really appreciate you hopping on and talking with us today. Glad to have you on the program. So we're talking about Windows Subsystem for Linux today, right?
WSL, man. That's I've talked about it for a couple of years now, so it's kind of a dearing project for me. It's really something that I love.
Has it really been a couple of years? Has it really been out long?
Yeah, WSL version 1 actually came out at the tail end of 2015.
That's right. Holy crap. Boy, time flies when you're having fun, right? I mean, like, I don't know. I still picture WSL as one of those things that's just like, hey, this cool new thing that came out. But it's not a new thing that came out, right? It's been out for a while. And it's, I would say it's matured nicely, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, now they've progressed from WSL version 1, WSL version 2, and they're actually supporting both, right? So W1 and 2 will coexist, and it's really based off of what your workload is, right? That's the whole thing around whether or not you stay with 1 or you go with 2. If you have heavy workloads that are disk intensive, you want to go with version 1, stay with that. Version 2 is more lightweight, right? So it made it much lighter, but and then now they've come out with graphics, right? So they keep on adding the capabilities to it. And they've got an actual dedicated development team for it. So they really are targeting this to be something that's not only in the client OS but also the server OS.
Yeah, it's such a cool idea because in a previous life, if I go way back to the beginning of my career, some 20 plus years ago, I'm dating myself a little bit now, but
I got almost 40 on you, so hey.
I shouldn't make that joke then, right? But if I go way back, there was a point in time where the hat on my head was labeled Linux administrator. So I remember what was the code name? So my first IT job was at a school system, which, any educational K through 12 school system budget is an issue, right? So there were several Debian Linux boxes in the house. And I want to say it was it Woody or Sarge that was version 3? I think Sarge was version 3 of Debian. Anyway, I remember we were running Debian Linux firewall. We were using IP tables on that box to be the firewall for the organization. And for content filtering for the students, we were using Dan's Guardian and Squid. Yep, combination of Dan's Guardian and Squid to do all the content filtering. So it's so fast forward to today, or the end of 2015, I should say. It's really weird for me now that, hey, I can run Linux apps on top of Windows. If you asked me that 15, 20 years ago, I'd have told you hell froze over, right?
Well, and think about it. I mean, I cut my teeth on Unix. That's how I got into IT. That's the first job that I had. Yeah, I worked on a system. A lot of people don't know what it is. It was made by Data General, and it was called Sequent, and it was actually called Sequent Linux. Yeah, so Sequent Unix, and I was an actual Data General Sequent administrator for a company that I started out as a night operator. So I used to work on night operators and AS4, not on AS400, but a System 36 and a System 38.
Okay.
And so they needed somebody to take over the admin of this Unix system. And they were like, hey, Unix? And I'm like, no, but I'd love to learn it. And okay, you're the guy. Okay, so yeah, that was, when I first got my break in. And I got to tell you, the utilities that I used back then still are relevant today. I mean, if I could go back in the Windows world and use utilities that I used in DOS back when, DOS, 4 and DOS 5, and 5.1 and 6, It's the same thing with Unix. I go back and I'm still using grep. I'm still
Yep.
using the find. I'm still using ls. I'm still using all these things. I mean, they just never go away. And it brings you back, like you said. It really does. I gotta ask, is that when you were actually considering becoming a band teacher, Andy? Is that when you were thinking? I'm sorry, I had to throw that in there. I had to throw it in there.
Right,
For those of
right.
you who don't know, Andy was going to be a band teacher.
I was almost a band teacher instead of going down this IT route. But, as I mentioned, band teachers in the US are having a hard time and have been for the last couple of decades. So that's why I ended up here in front of this lovely camera, right? So, but
Exactly.
yeah, it's funny you mention, using tools today that you used back then. Same thing here, like you mentioned grep. I just used grep yesterday. I run a Minecraft server for my kid and his buddies, and we were looking for something in the logs, and I'm just like, get grep out, and my kid's watching. He's 12. He's old enough to kind of start grasping some command line concepts, and he's like, "Boy, you know a lot of code, Dad." And I'm just like, yeah, I've been doing this for 20 plus years, but you're absolutely true. That's one thing I will say about Linux and Unix is that it almost feels like the tools are timeless, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you get so used to having them available. And then fast forward to today and WSL, I find that even though Windows is my primary OS, I'll open up WSL to run a command line tool inside of WSL on top of Windows. Like, for example, 7-zip. I used to go out and grab 7-zip and install it so it'd be in the right-click context menu in Explorer, right? I don't do that anymore. I just open up WSL. I have a Debian instance on WSL, and I run 7-zip from the command line to unzip, 7-zip files. So that's just one example. But so I feel like we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here. What I want to do is for those that aren't fully aware, how would you define Windows Subsystem for Linux? What is it exactly?
So the WSL really is, when it started out, it's two different things, right? When it started out, it was one thing, and they kind of brought it to a little bit more maturity that it is today. So when it started out, it was just something that would allow you to be able to work between a Linux operating system and a Windows operating system together, right? It wasn't the full Linux kernel, though, right? So it was like a hodgepodge, duct tape together, I call it, type of it was. It was like an emulator. It really was. It was like an emulator because it was, running a full virtual machine in order to give you that emulation of a Linux box.
Yep.
And it was the first steps. Now they've actually, with WSL2, it's actually a full kernel, and it's embedded in the operating system. It's part of every distribution. So it really is a way to merge both worlds. It's the ability to do everything from sharing file systems to sharing applications that are in memory together, being able to do all those things and have both worlds together. This brings up a really cool story. I don't know if we remember, but back in the early 2000, late 1990s, when Steve Ballmer was running the show, he had come out and said that Linux was a cancer. And that Linux was evil, and that Linux had no place in the computing world.
That was not a great look.
Yeah. I don't know if and I remember, you can go out on YouTube and you can look up the clip where he's actually talking on stage during one of the events for Microsoft, and he's just going after, why would anyone want to use this crappy file system? Steve, he would just spew.
It's like a bowl in a china cabinet.
Yeah. But it's so, to me, it goes to show that how everyone was, pretty much siloed back then. Now it's all one big world. And it really is, Satya comes in and says, hey, we need to embrace this. We need to do this because we have people, what the number one operating system in Azure is today?
It's Linux. Yep.
It is.
I
It's the
forget.
number one.
I forget
It
what
is.
the percentage is. It's pretty high though, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
it's very high. And the thing about it is that you wouldn't have seen that if Azure would have been built 15, 20 years ago. They wouldn't even probably have Linux as an option in the
Yep.
marketplace. It'd
Yep.
be like, oh no, you want to do that, you're on your own. We're not going to support you.
Right.
Yeah. So now they come to marry the two together, and I think they did it the right way. The WSL brings it all together, and you have the ability to operate between both worlds, if you
Yep.
will. And they are different worlds. Anybody who knows the difference between Linux and Windows, they really are two different
Oh yeah.
worlds.
Definitely. Very much
So,
so. So we kind of know what it is, and we've already given a couple of examples, but one question I see come up in the community quite frequently is, what's the use case here? Who exactly is WSL for, and what problem are we trying to solve with it? Kind of what are your thoughts on that, Mike?
So back in, it must have been like 2017. 2016, 2017. I did my first WSL presentation for, it was V Brown Bag, I think. It was either V Brown Bag or it was, I can't remember. Oh, MVP Days. For Dave's Qualis
Oh
MVP
yeah,
Days.
it's a great conference. I hope
It
I hope they
was.
bring it back. I think they did one recently, but yeah, definitely a great conference if you haven't checked it out.
Yep. Yeah, MVP Days. Anyways, going back to that, it was always like everyone first question is why? Why do this? What is this? What does this do for me?
Yep.
And then of course you had the really stronghold Microsoft folks that were like, this is ridiculous. For what reason? What reason would you have to do this? We're trying to make cross-platform tools, that you can develop Linux applications on Windows. You don't even have to touch Linux. But the fact of the matter is that if you've been a developer in the Linux world and you're given a Windows type of scenario, or you need to do cross-platform development, it's really hard.
Right.
It's not an easy thing to do. I've had some developers that have said to me that this is like a godsend to them because they can actually interact with both and be programming or coding in the same IDE.
Right.
And having it going cross-platform. That's huge.
Yeah.
The amount of time that's spent with all the CI/CD pipelines and Azure DevOps or DevOps in general, where you're trying to push, builds out on a nightly basis, weekly basis, and do all of that. This is really, really big.
Right.
And second of all, the use case that I found probably most prevalent in the work that I do is around the sysadmins. Because a lot of sysadmins, number one, were either raised on Linux and Unix,
right?
Okay, and they got forced into Windows, and they complain about it still today, like Windows, and Microsoft with the dollar signs. That's how they when they put something out there.
Yep.
Yeah, but they were forced into it. It's kind of like a Mac user, right? So a Mac user gets forced to use Windows, and all they do is complain about it. It's kind of the same way. But you had sysadmins, and they'd be like, well, you know what? I'm cool with it. Give me a Windows interface. I'm cool with that. But I still have appliances, or I still have vendors that say that you need to administer this from a Linux type of platform or a Linux command line. You need to know Bash. You have to know Bash, a shell.
Yep.
Like Bash, like Z shell, like, whatever. But you still need that capability. As an example, how many guys, have gone into working with ESXi in the vSphere?
Yeah. And
they're like, hey, I can just use vCenter and I can click around. You know what? You got to go into ESXi sometimes, and that's Linux.
Yep.
That's what it is, really. And now vCenter is actually Linux. It's not Windows anymore. So all of these appliances and all of these applications that were centric on Windows are being migrated to a much slimmer, a much faster operating system, like Linux. And these admins have to get, have the both worlds to work with that.
Yep. And, I will say, as much as I love VS Code is amazing, and I use it for markdown editing almost on a daily basis. I don't know if it's the old Linux administrator in me. I am still a sucker for Vim after all these
You're
years.
using Vim?
I still use it once in a while. It's just something
I'm a
about
Vi guy.
yeah. Oh, what, a Vi guy?
I'm a Vi guy.
Vi.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. Well, at least you're not one of those weird Emacs people. I'm just gonna say, and my apologies if I've offended anyone with that. Emacs is completely fine for those that use it. It's really weird though.
Yeah, I just actually had an old friend of mine who asked me how he was having problems with the WSL. For those who don't know, with WSL, you have to have a specific build of Windows, right? You have to have Windows for WSL version 2 and the ability to do some other, things. So you have to be on a different ring, an insider ring, in order to get these new things.
Yep.
And this friend of mine was having a problem. But the problem came down to it. He's like, you know what? And I can't get Emacs to run. I'm like, what? So what did you just say?
So Ian Malcolm comes into my mind right now. Like, you were so preoccupied with whether you could, you didn't stop to think if you should.
Exactly.
All right. So we've talked about what it is. We know who it's for. And I think the next thing I kind of want to talk about a little bit, and you alluded to this a little bit earlier in the show, is that we've talked about running CLI-based applications with WSL so far. We talked about Vim, VI, Emacs for those weird people. I think I mentioned 7-zip earlier. And you mentioned earlier that we can now run GUI apps with WSL version 2 now, correct?
Right. So anything that I shouldn't say anything, but it's developing, right? So there are a lot of what they call GNU, GNU. If you're from the Unix world, you remember GNU. It's the big RAM,
Right.
That's GNU RAM. Yeah. Those types of applications can now run on what they call is WSL-G, and it's WSL with graphics capability. So there's a WSL, okay, and then you add the G, and then that adds the graphics capability using GPU. So if you want to run graphical applications, you actually add some components to WSL, and those components work with like NVIDIA GPUs and AMD GPUs, and allows you to run applications like if you've ever heard of GIMP. Okay, GIMP is Blender. Blender is a very popular 3D animation application for Linux that's used in Hollywood quite a bit, by the way. But you need to have some components that allow for that graphic, okay? Because graphics are intensive, and you got to remember that you're running something in a very small space. It's a very small footprint, very small space. But yeah, it definitely has opened up a lot of possibilities, being able to run applications like that, and you run them seamlessly. So that means that I can have a WSL terminal window open. I can enter the command of just GIMP, and hit enter, and then the GIMP actual X window comes up on my Windows 10 box, and it looks like an Xbox. I mean, an X Windows application. I call it an Xbox. It's not like Windows, Microsoft Xbox. Right. But it looks like an X Windows application, but it's seamless. You can click and drag it around the screen. You can, it goes behind Windows 10 windows. It does, it looks somewhat like it could be native. But inherently X Windows doesn't look like, Microsoft Windows. But it opens the door to so many other things. It really does.
And, definitely.
It also allows for audio. They've added the pulse audio to it.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah. So,
nice.
Applications like VLC, Video LAN, for those that don't know that, and Winamp for Linux. Yeah.
We get Winamp back. So are they still calling it XMMS inside of the Linux world?
No, that's one flavor. Right?
Gotcha.
That's one flavor of X windowing system, right? So they actually use a different one that they use called Wayland, which is part of yeah, it's called Wayland, and it actually uses protocols in there to produce X Wayland. So Microsoft actually had to come up with its own shell in order to do this. Okay, and they call it the Rail shell. It's called Rails, and it has a subname called Veil. But they had to come up with this shell in order for the Microsoft produced kernel to understand how to drive these graphical applications.
Right.
So it has its own shell. They put a lot of work into that. And then they came up with the whole, programming for behind Weston and Wayland, brought in Pulse Audio. So it really has come a long ways, and they are going to continue to develop it. They've actually said that this is their future. So it's going to be an integral part of the Windows OS.
Nice. One thing this makes me think of, it almost feels like the precursor to what they announced in the Windows 11 event. I don't know if you recall, they announced Android apps running on top of Windows.
Yeah.
So it feels like a lot of this is some of the building blocks in order to enable that functionality in Windows 11, right?
Yeah, exactly. And you think about that, it's just another integration that people said would never happen. Because you remember you used to have an emulator that you could run an Android app in, and people complain because it's an emulator.
Yeah.
Now it's going to be native. I mean, that's kind of big.
Yeah.
When you think about it, because that opens up a whole new world. Now, of course, they're going to restrict the store aspect of it, just like they do with WSL.
Right.
WSL, they restrict the store aspect of it. So, you get distributions from the Microsoft Store. You can create your own custom images, and you can use those.
Right.
But again, if you want the actual supported ones, you have to go through the store.
Right.
And that I think is a little bit of a hindrance. They haven't opened it up because they're still trying to keep some control around the issues that are generated, because literally they have over 10,000 issues out in GitHub around WSL.
I believe it.
I mean,
I believe it.
It's crazy.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I'm glad you mentioned that, the option to build your own distro. My preferred distro has always been Debian. And when this first came out, Debian wasn't an official option yet. So I remember I stumbled across the GitHub repo for it one time. Distro Builder, I think, is what the repo is called.
Yeah.
And I'll be sure to link that in the show notes for those of you that are watching, or if you're listening, it'll be in the show notes as well. But I haven't gotten around to it yet, but one of these days I'm going to spin up a Gentoo instance of WSL. So just because I always like tinkering with Gentoo, the whole idea of from source distributions was always fun.
Yeah.
Everybody talks about Arch. I never got around to actually running Arch. Whenever I wanted to do from source, it was always Gentoo, right?
Yeah, it was Arch, and they came out with another one that's more of a consumer type of Linux called Penguin.
Yeah, yep, I've heard of that one too.
But that's really more consumer based. It's not geared towards a developer. They put a lot of work into the UI and making it really flashy, things like that.
Gotcha.
But I will say around the creation of the customs, I actually had a company that I was working with when WSL2 hadn't come out yet. But I was working with the company with WSL1, and they needed a custom distro created because they would basically take that distro and they would provide it to their development teams offshore. And they wanted to package all of everything that they wanted developed into a single distribution. They didn't want anyone to go astray of what was inside of that distribution.
Interesting.
So that was really kind of cool because they could integrate that with WSL. They basically said, here's this distribution, bring it into WSL, and you can develop on that. That was for everybody, when they had offshore development taken care of for them.
So it was almost like it reminds me almost of like an appliance, like a virtual appliance approach almost, is kind of what, that's interesting. So you have
a container.
Yeah.
It's just a container. That's all it is. I mean, when you think about it, it's not a full VM. Well, at that time it was because it was WSL version 1.
Right.
But it's just a container. That's all it is.
Yeah, that's interesting. So now it doesn't matter where the developer's at. They have a uniform experience wherever they run it from. That's,
Just like a custom image for a VM. You go up into Azure, you can upload a custom image, custom and be able to use that. It's kind of the same premise. You're just giving them the distribution, the Linux distribution, to be able to just throw into WSL, or attach, I should say, to WSL.
Right. Yeah, it's cool stuff. It's cool stuff. So one thing I kind of want to touch on really quick, we've talked about these different distributions. So I guess from an official, I'm sure there's an official supportability list somewhere, and I'll be sure to get that and include that in the show notes as well. But up top of your head, what are some of our distro options? I know Ubuntu, Debian. I gotta imagine Fedora is probably on there too. Do you know any of the others?
SUSE.
SUSE. Okay.
Yeah. So SUSE is a big one. You can go into the store. Anything that's in the store is supportable.
Got it. Okay.
The only problem is that the ones that are paid, are the ones that the vendor has to support, not Microsoft.
Not Microsoft. Got it.
So Microsoft only supports like 5 different distributions, and that's it.
Yep.
And that would be the Ubuntu, Kali. They support Kali as well.
Yep.
Yeah, Kali, and SUSE, Fedora, or Red Hat, whatever. Yep. I don't know what they're calling it now.
Right.
Yeah, CentOS is gone. I don't, that whole thing confuses me. And then, Debian. Yeah, so that's pretty much it right there from a, Microsoft supportability. Because if you think about it, Andy, you remember when you were working with Unix and Linux, you were more focused on what the kernel was.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
Because the kernel was everything. And the kernel, if that is not modified, if you maintain that between distributions, then you're good to go, because you can support that.
Yep.
It might have different package managers, it does an apt, or it does an RPM or whatever it does. I don't know. Those are just personalities of the distribution. That isn't the actual heart of the distribution. The kernel is.
Yep.
So if the kernel matches, you can support just about any distribution.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. It takes me back to the my days creating custom Linux kernels with injected NVIDIA driver modules and stuff. Yeah. And I remember the first time I made my own kernel, I forgot to compile in SATA support. Yeah. So I go to try and boot my kernel, and it's like, I don't see any boot devices.
Yeah.
Because you didn't compile in SATA support, you dummy.
Yeah, I bricked a production system when I started out. I bricked it because I left out 3 or 4 different drivers that are just absolutely necessary.
Yeah.
And come back and it's like it won't boot. Yeah.
Yep.
It won't do anything. Oh no.
Good times. Now you have to boot into, rescue mode, go grab the old configure your kernel, recompile, and put it back in place. Oh, yeah. I'm having flashbacks. So, all right. Well, let's, I want to talk about one other thing here before we kind of wrap up for the episode here. And that is from the SysAdmin's perspective. And we've kind of touched on this a little bit. From a manageability point of view, what are my options as a system administrator? Let's say maybe I have a team of developers and they all need this. What are my options for getting it to them? It's just a Windows feature, right?
Right. So they need to be on any version of Windows 10 will run WSL v1.
Yep.
And then anything past Windows 10 1909 or 1903, I'm sorry, will run WSL v2.
Got it.
But some of the more advanced features that they've been coming out with, like the WSL-G and things like that, that requires to be on the beta channel or the developer channel for the insiders.
Got it.
So you have to be like, in order to get the latest kernel for the GPU, you have to be on 2.1H1, and 2.1H1 just came out.
Yep.
Yeah. So there's a lot of different versions and things out there. But if they are basically just want to run something on WSL1 or WSL2, maybe they have a Docker integration, which is a good example. So Docker Desktop, and I don't know how many folks are aware of this, but Docker Desktop now has direct integration with WSL.
Oh, really?
So, yeah.
Nice.
So in Docker Desktop, you could always pick either running Linux containers or Windows containers, right? Right. So now it actually integrates directly into WSL. So you can be in a WSL Linux session and run Docker, and it's going to run off of your Docker desktop. It's going to use the images that are in your Docker desktop.
Okay.
So, and then you can do the same thing in a command window on Windows and run the same image. So that's how the whole cross-platform goes. But from a developer standpoint, you're just going to say, this is the image you need to use. You download it from the Microsoft Store, or else provide them with a link to the image. Okay. And then they can import it into WSL with a single command, or else just, click on install from the Microsoft Store, and then they're up and running.
Nice.
It literally takes, I timed it. I installed I go through Kali quite a bit. I use Kali quite a bit. And the reason why I use Kali is, I don't know if you're familiar or anyone's familiar with this, but Kali is has a lot of security functionality.
Right.
So I do a lot of work with that, and I go through, I'll mess one up and I got to reinstall, and I'll, all that other kind of fun stuff.
Yep.
And I actually installed it just yesterday, and it literally took about 12, 13 seconds for it to install and set up. Boom, it was done.
That's nice.
That was it.
That's nice.
Yeah. Right. So how long would it take you to spin up a VM? That's just it.
Right.
I got a Kali VM. How long is it going to take me to build that and spin it up? It's not going to be 12 or 13 seconds.
At least 20 minutes. At least.
Yeah. No, now, granted, you get more functionality with the VM, right? You have a, you have the everything that you can do inside of there. There's no restrictions. With WSL, you do have restrictions. But what do you have to do? That's just it. What work do you have to do, and will this work for you?
Right.
Most 90% of the work that I do, WSL, I don't have to build a Linux VM anymore. I just add another instance of a WSL and I'm done.
Right. Talking through that whole thing kind of brings up a kind of a, I don't want to say unique, because it's certainly not unique, but kind of a more obscure use case that I can think of. So earlier in my career, I used to do a lot of IT work for various manufacturers. And I can recall one manufacturer that they had these huge CNC mills. I mean, huge. We're talking like they were cutting huge pieces of sheet metal and stuff. I mean, you had a whole building and there were only 4 of these big CNC mills. Yeah. And they ran a version of Linux for the control for the CNC mill. And they had a USB dongle that was the licensing mechanism, right? So a lot of those manufacturing vendors, they love to use that hardware dongle for the licensing. I don't know if you know, but what level of access does WSL have to the hardware of the Windows machine running on it? Because the use case I'm thinking of is, you got a lot of those manufacturers that they'll let those systems get 15, 20 years old because it costs an arm and a leg to replace them. And, if you're the system admin having to take care of those, that makes you nervous as hell, right?
Yeah.
So if you could put them on like a newer supported Windows machine and run that through WSL, I'd be all over that if that worked, Yeah.
So it all depends on what exactly is being brought through from the because it's a para-virtualization. It's from the Windows hardware level up into the Linux kernel. There is, compatibility there. So you can be in a Linux instance in WSL, and you can mount drives on the Windows side. You can, you're working with hard drive or not only logical drives but physical drives.
Right.
You can do that. You can also address certain ports based off of if you can actually address them. So sometimes Windows doesn't allow you to address ports.
Right.
But I have seen it done where people can actually, talk directly to a USB port if the Linux kernel supports it. So in that scenario, it could be possible. It's just that it needs to be tested because I've seen it work and I've seen it fail, but I've seen it work and fail based off of the Linux distribution, not the Windows side, really. It was based off of what Linux would allow.
Gotcha. Something in the yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
Well, it uses an old Bell Labs protocol to communicate between the hardware abstraction layer on the Windows side onto the WSL side. And when it does that, not everything comes across.
Right.
So yeah, and you will see issues out there in GitHub where they say, yeah, this works, but this doesn't work. I don't think they officially support certain types. They don't support like FireWire. They don't support things like that.
Right.
But it's something that would have to be tested.
Or Digiboard. You remember Digiboard?
The octopus cables. Yeah,
right. I used to do IT support for a tire retreading plant, and they had this old SCO Unix box in the closet with those octopus cables going out to the machines on the on the shop floor. I remember
that
dealing with
and that's
thing.
how we used to hook up modems to a Linux box. We would use a Digiboard and basically hook up on the end of every one of those octopus cables was a 25-pin connection to a modem. An actual U.S. robotics modem that was sitting there, plugged into the wall at its 14.4 or 28.8 or whatever it was working at.
Oh man, 28.8. Those were the days.
Yeah. 2400, 9600.
That's right. Right.
Yeah.
Good times.
So pretty much this whole show, all we've talked about is how old we are, Andy.
I know, right? And it's just going to get worse every episode we do after this, I'm sure. So, well, Mike, it's been great having you. I really appreciate having you on the show. We'll have to have you on for another one in the future. How can folks get a hold of you if they want to reach out?
Yeah, so hit me up on Twitter and Mike Nelson IO on Twitter. You can look at my GitHub stuff. Again, Mike Nelson -IO. Got a difference in username because you can't have the world the way you want it. Just anything with Mike Nelson IO, you'll probably hit me up. That's the best way to reach me.
Hey, sounds good, Mike. Well, hey, thanks for being here. We appreciate it. And folks watching or listening, we appreciate you checking out the show. Be sure to check out all of our social media handles. Mine is @aserwich. I will be sure to put that in the show notes because I'm not going to ask you to spell that. My apologies there. And also, I'll be sure to put the Altera software and the Hornet Security social media channels in the show notes as well. And with that, if you need some additional content, we've got the Altera dojos with an entire breadth of different IT content.
Which is awesome, by the way.
Appreciate that, Mike. We got to get you on there as an author at some point. You and I need to talk about that. But we've got Hyper-V content, we've got VMware content, MSP content. We now have sections for backup and recovery, and we soon will have sections for M365, Azure, and Windows as well. So we are. It used to be just a Hyper-V blog, and now it's like all of the things, So they're definitely keeping me busy. So be sure to check those out. I'll put all the relevant links in the show notes. Other than that, appreciate you guys watching, and we hope to see you for a future episode of the Dojo Podcast. Thanks for listening.